Right now is the former Iranian ambassador to the UN.
By boycotting it, that we ultimately helped bringing an end to the 8-year bloody Iran-Iraq war. It is through direct experience, therefore, that I think the mantra for the modern international relations in the new century is engagement rather than estrangement. Now, before my distinguished panelists give me a hard look, let me turn to our topic today, that is Iran's new parliament and its implications for U.S. Iran relations. You will see in a few minutes how the new parliament election in Iran has set a landmark turning point with far-reaching implications for Iran's domestic and foreign policies in the future. It is important in the big picture to note that all other developments aside, the sound economic infrastructure of Iran has found a perfect match in Iran's political structure as the result of the recent election. Now, how the reform process is institutionalized, what are the short-term and long-term implications of these developments, and in particular, what is the meaning of these developments for U.S.-Iran relations? These are questions to be answered by our patient panelists. Now, let me refer to our panelists today. You have read their bios for yourself. I would like to refer to the personal experience I've had with all three of our distinguished panelists. Dr. Hadi Samati, a professor at Tehran University, Dr. Nasser Hadian, another friend and professor at Tehran University. I have known both gentlemen since 4 or 5 years ago, when we started to get engaged in many talks here in Washington and elsewhere, dealing with think tanks, talking about U.S.-Iran relations, the prospect, the development in domestic politics in Iran and elsewhere. And I think they have had a wonderful service of education, both to American audience and to Iranian audience. The American audience, you have experienced for yourself. In the last few days, they have been engaged in so many talks and panels here in Washington, and extensively they have tackled and touched and talked about different sides of Iranian domestic politics. But on the Iranian side, probably some of you do not know that they have also made a major participation in the reform movement. How? That's very impressive, because I have found out that many of the reform leaders in Iran today have been their students, getting their master's and PhD degrees, have been their students, and through them, I think, have been acquainted with the virtues of Western democracies. I think one of the graduate students, I've been one of the leaders of the reform movement, recently shot in Iran, and which is a very unfortunate event. In any case, as I said, I don't get deep into various capacities and talents that my colleagues have, and I will ask them to talk. Siamak Namazi, also a great friend of mine. I have known him for quite a number of years. He went quite fast in being a well-known figure to report on Iran. He lives in Iran and reports from there. His analysis is really impressive. He reports on economic developments in Iran. And the good memory, one of the best memories that I have from Siamak Namazi is that 2 years ago, when I was teaching a course on Iran's foreign policy in Georgetown University, he was with me the whole semester, and he kept my class quite lively and challenging the whole time. Having said all about our friends. Let me stop here and invite Dr. Hadi Samati to talk to you on developments after the parliamentary election. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the kind words and introduction. And I would like at this time to extend my gratitude to American Iranian Council for inviting me to present my position and my thoughts on the Iranian election, recent election. Of course, I'm not going to get into much detail. I have very little time. I'm going to try to stick with the generalities and what I would consider to be the general trends facing Iran and in the next 4 or 5 years in the context of the election, the parliamentary election. I will spend most of my time with the foreign policy questions, and my friend Siamak will most likely deal with economic issues, and Nasser Hadian will most likely get into a little bit of analysis of the election itself and what it means.
Excuse me, we don't see the speaker. Would you be kind to stand here?
Absolutely.
Bring all the papers.
Of course, nothing is like body language. Huh? Just a brief introduction in terms of what Majlis election and what parliamentary elections ended up looking like. Of course, foreign policy was not a major issue in the campaign at all. Of course, as a dominant issue. Domestic politics and reform in the Iranian political structure and other issues were the priority, and it seems to be the priority for the next few months at least. Of course, at the general level, the double-sided campaign slogan of President Khatami, reducing tension and normalization with the outside world, and democratic reform inside, played some role in the campaign process. But I would argue predominantly a campaign was on domestic agenda. However, I would argue that foreign policy will be shaped and influenced by the results of the election. The parliamentary election gave a predominant victory to the reformist camp, for sure. A majority that would definitely mean, to the best of my analysis, best of my knowledge, not so much of a powerful, numerically speaking, voice for the conservative camp. So the reformists will have a preponderant position within the parliament to advance their positions and issues. If the domestic politics were the overriding concern for reform movement and pro-Khatami participation front in particular, how would then a victory for reformists and a small minority, however powerful, outside the parliament, how would that Majlis, that parliament, affect foreign policy areas? My core argument essentially is that we are facing a new beginning in Iranian politics, and Majlis, in particular the parliament, is going to play a more significant role and more institutionally powerful role than the last 20 years. This is essentially my argument that a new institutionalism is emerging. I will explain in a little bit what I mean by that. First of all, it's the political dynamics of defeat, what I have called. The conservative camp has been defeated beyond anybody's expectation. That in and of itself is going to create a soul-searching, and has already begun a soul-searching process within the conservative camp. A soul-searching process that has led already to the rising of what some columnists in Tehran has called it new conservatism in Iran, or what others have called pragmatic conservatism. However, beyond the soul-searching dynamics and the dynamics of defeat itself, I would argue that there are structural trends that are taking place as well. The structural trends that are impossible to ignore. Beyond the issues that were discussed indirectly this morning and by Ambassador Maulati, the issue of globalization and availability of more information technology, communication technology, and greater transparency, and the rest of issues that you have all been familiar with over the last 2 years, we are witnessing an emergence of roles of bureaucratic institutions in settling and formulating policies. When I said the beginning of a new era, I meant the end of personally oriented or personalistically oriented policymaking. The erosion of personalities, which was pretty much clear by the vote that former President Rafsanjani got in the election, meant that transparency is the dominant aspiration and outlook of the electorate. And that's their desire and their demand. That transparency, with the help of a lively press, has made it very difficult for officials to stick with the old ways of policy formulation and deliberation. So beyond the globalization effect, the spread of educational opportunities for different classes and different groupings, and the emerging role of bureaucracies in making decision-making, my suspicion is that all of these trends are going to be actually translated into a more coherent and aggressive attempt on the part of the Majlis to engage in policy formulation. If, for anything else, we're going to have a young Majlis, relatively, some have argued the average age has gone down by 10 to 15 years at least. Totally new, basically new, almost 78% new MPs in Parliament, more educated MPs, and definitely agenda-driven and aggressive MPs. With these characteristics, the structural trends that are shaping itself into the political scene, and the growing awareness of the public, I would argue that a recent analysis by a friend of ours that not only the moderation is taking hold at the top, at the elite level, the constituency of the electorate, the constituency of the new MPs are also themselves moderate and very much involved in a moderate and gradual reform. So with those structural trends and at the same time the dynamics of politics that seems to be irreversible, I argued that the old cliches of perceiving Iran as a monolithic force, as a few persons at the top deciding about major issues, are over. And those particular U.S. foreign policy establishment that has dealt with authoritarian regimes in Latin America and other places got to re-examine its perception and its analysis of Iranian political structure. This is what I think would be important for many. So that's essentially what it will entail. The constraints that are affecting conservative camp and those who oppose President Khatami's policies are becoming more institutional and at some level personal as well. So there are constraints built into these overlapping institutions and this dispersed power structure. And that we are going to see more and more debate and more collision on policy issues. And of course, the last, if not the least, a more rational debate over many of these policy issues. The Parliament, I think, is going to be engaged in a more serious debate over foreign policy issues, and of course, it's not going to be a voice of opposition for sure. However, because of the evolving nature of rational policymaking, evolving institutionalism, and the emerging of a new right, very much comparable to the new right probably in the U.S. context, a more pragmatic conservatives, we're going to see issues being dealt individually, depending on the risk-taking capability of new members, of new MPs, and the reactions of the international community, international players, and the nature of the issue involved, things and policies the deliberation at least, and the debate in the Majlis could take different course. So not only at the same time we're going to see a more rational process of making decisions and a more transparent process and a public awareness at the public level, we're going to see a more complex and sophisticated way of tackling issues because of exactly of these sort of things that I just mentioned. So if you're going to have a risk-taking MP in the Majlis on certain issues, you may have the same individual not taking a whole lot of risk in that very particular issue. So we're talking about a more sophisticated, if you will, and a more involved parliament. And of course, because of that, all of those developments are taking place within the context of what I have called a few contradictory trends. What are those contradictory trends? The election, particularly the last three elections, the presidential election, the municipality election, and of course the latest parliamentary election, have given a sense of self-confidence to the public and of course to the elites and to the intellectuals and to the press and everybody else. At the same time that you have a self-confidence building up, there is a degree of confusion. This is an opposing trend. Confusion because it's an open-ended process. Nobody knows what the ideal type democracy is and how its compatibility with Islam and Islamic texts and doctrines are going to play out itself. So when you have a self-confidence emerging, at the same time you have in any reform process, you have a confusion, a soul-searching process, a not definite answer to a lot of questions that many reformists have. Secondly, as it relates to foreign policy, I argued, the rising security political dimensions of the issues, as opposed to the contrary trend of ideologically motivated argumentation. Even though we have witnessed an erosion of ideological decision-making on foreign policy issues, there is still a substantial and considerable degree of ideology involved in many issues, particularly within the context of more vital and important issues facing Iran. So the rising security political dimensions of issues being involved, or the national interest of Iran in making policies outside. At the same time, you have still very lively and coherent, I would say, in that respect, and very well connected to the constituency, ideological component still very, very alive. And it's something that has to be taken seriously. And that's no wonder why the Saudis actually went to Iran and extended their visit, their invitation to Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei to go to Hajj. And their understanding, I think, of Iranian politics is getting more and more sophisticated. At the same time, another trend is the consensus as the basis of policy formulation and policy advocacy. A consensus is building on many issues and many issue areas, but at the same time, people understand that there are constraints. There are debates, there are opposition, there are advocates of contradictory positions and contradictorian position, as one of my friends said. So these are another sets of issues that people on the Majlis, the MPs, will have to face. On many issues which I will briefly touch, there are basically already over the last 3-4 years consensus emerging and emerged. But there are still a whole range of other issues fundamentally opposing views. Then, lastly, there is a growing realization that there are greater options available to Iran in foreign policy arena and in international politics. The engagement with the Europeans, with the Persian Gulf states, and the rest of the, and to some extent South Asian and Southeast Asian countries, are giving, at least reinforcing the source of self-confidence that exists already in the political establishment. So at the same time, Iranian foreign policy establishment is perceiving its latitude to be more and more as days go by. But at the same time, there is a realization that there are constraints to that, particularly when it relates to U.S. Iranian relationship. U.S. is still the most powerful military nation. It has its great influence in the region. It's to the north of Iran, it's to the east of Iran, it's to the west of Iran, and it's to the south of Iran. So U.S. is going to be there, and definitely if you talk about greater options and greater options in the international arena, people understand the nature of that growing option. Given all that, I would urge people to take notice of what some have called the frozen image of Iran in the minds of people, at least in policy circles in Washington and other places. Okay, with that background, with that introduction, we're going to see in the Parliament, in my judgment, the development of three centrist positions vis-a-vis domestic and international issues. The conservative camp would definitely move into a more pragmatic nature, in the parliament at least, if not outside the parliament. Despite the fact that there would be still a strong conservative constituency there, which has to be dealt with, which has to be addressed, and the U.S. officials and policymakers should take that also very seriously. Not to side with a particular body or particular orientation, and not to make a good guy, bad guy script out of this Washington scene and Washington deliberation. So, given these developments, how would the Majlis and the Parliament will tackle some of the basic issues? I think with the development of the centrist position on the right and the centrist position on the left, people have talked about a lot about these divergences and disagreements in the coalition of reformists. My suspicion is, given the exigencies of time, the imperatives of reform domestically, as people have argued, is going to reinforce a moderation in the international arena as well. So there would be a centrist position developing on the reformist camp as well, and we already have a very weakened, of course, I would say, centrist position already with the Executive of Construction Party. Even though they showed very poorly in the election, less than 10%, and some, I think it's, Siamak was saying it's about 7% performance in terms of the seats that they could actually gain in the parliamentary election. So given that evolving centrist positions within the political spectrum, I expect that the agenda-driven and very assertive parliamentarian would be a positive force behind Khatami's rapprochement with the outside world. I would not get into the details of issues, but I would suggest that if one takes at least, or accept my suggestion and my arguments that these three camps are going to evolve, and the greater institutionalism and rationalization of policy-making process in Iran, with growing constraints placed upon conservative institutions, we are going to see a very, very complicated and contentious arena in the parliament in the next 4 years, for sure. And domestic politics, I would think, would override everything else in the first 6 to 8 months. In that note, I think I'm going to stop. I know there are a lot of detailed questions which I try to respond if indeed there is a need for discussion of that. Thank you very much.
Would you please listen to come?
Thank you, Ambassador Mahalati. I first want to thank AIC for putting together this wonderful event, and I expect that this won't be the peak of AIC's performance, but just one of the highs. It's a little intimidating being surrounded by so many professors, Dr. Mahalati and Dr. Amir Ahmadi, of course, and Dr. Hadian and Semati act as my de facto professors in Tehran while I'm out of school. I'll try to keep this short and spare you with my analysis of the breakdown of the new Majlis and how it went. There are copies of Iran Focus outside that have some of that, and there's a Majlis report floating around that you can take a look at and hopefully return. But I think it is important to see what did happen. So let's start there before going on to the impact of the new Majlis on economic policy in Iran. Echoing some of what Dr. Semati just said, judging from the patterns of votes in the first round, which was very telling, and the patterns are what you're being spared of, we could guess the ultimate results of the elections with a fair amount of accuracy at this point. Atiya Bahar, my company, predicts the following breakdown of the Majlis, and I say that that is ours because you will hear some discrepancies. 190 seats we expect to be given to the reform camp. Now this is after the second round is all done. And we can break that down as follows. 130 to the leftist parties of the reform camp, which is Mosharakat and Hambastagi and others. 60 seats to the centrist figures related to the executives of the Construction Party and their sister party, Etidal and Toseh, which means moderation and development. 50 seats to the conservatives, and the remaining 50 seats to the independent and local figures. The most important aspect of what I just told you is that should the reform camp maintain its coalition, and the reform camp is currently a coalition of 18 varying factions, the conservatives can't play the game of filibustering and obstruction. A favorite point of Nasser Hadi on there. But on a number of tough economic issues, where the centrist players are more likely to vote along the same lines as the conservatives, should they manage to convince a good portion of the independents that they can overcome the 130 leftist bloc. Let's move along. What else do we know about this Majlis, which will help us predict their behavior? Well, only 27% of the 5th Majlis parliamentarians are going to be in the new Majlis. In other words, close to 2/3 of the Majlis is new faces. We've flushed out the old guys. This is a very good indication of just how unpopular the conservative forces in Iran have become. In a continuation of a trend we've seen since the second Majlis elections, the number of clerics voted into parliament has dropped tremendously. I believe currently in the first round there's about a dozen clerics, and that is it. Along the same lines, we see a continuation in the rise of MPs with master's degrees and above. Perhaps this trend is a good reflection of where the people of Iran stand in regarding to a long-time debate within the ruling establishment, specifically whether it is the Islamic nature of Iran which should take precedence or the Republican aspect. We can only expect that the Islamic Republic of Iran will continue to grow to underline its Republican aspects as time goes on. It's also very clear that most of the voters elected their representatives by using one of the faction's lists or an altered version of it. This means that individual sway plays a lot lesser role than in the past, particularly in large urban areas. Again, a good way to predict what we can expect from this reformist parliament, the breakdown of which I just gave you, is by taking a look at the main characteristics of the majority of those who gain seats in the 6th Majlis. What do we know? Generalities about the people. Well, we know they've proven indeed that they care about public opinion. Public opinion is becoming more and more important in today's Iran. They've been critical of the regime's conduct. They've been actively associated with President Khatami's reform process. They're experts in their own fields, and we should underline their own fields, which isn't necessarily politics or policy. In the provincial area, we see what we've always seen, and that's that local celebrities are taking the seats. So what can we expect from this Majlis in the early days? Well, no doubt the new Majlis, which is dominated by persons that fit the above description, will help President Khatami and the reform movement, mainly by putting into law what was done by executive order before. The question is, however, what kind of laws will the 6th Majlis focus on after it takes over parliament this June? Many analysts believe that the new Majlis will concentrate on domestic politics, particularly cultural issues. This could include easing requirements for the formation of political parties. That's a very important one. Revision of the press law, legalizing satellite dishes, reviewing the election laws, or even to attempt to change legislative structure, particularly to reduce the powers of the Guardian Council. There are several reasons for reformists to concentrate on such issues. The group that we refer to broadly as reformists in Iranian politics is actually the coalition of 18 factions. I keep mentioning that. Keeping in mind that coalitions tend to be stronger when in opposition, and as they move towards position, differences that arise, it only makes sense that the leaders build on common ground issues and those that are less contentious. It is appropriate to mention here that the Iranian political factions that we keep talking about, the left and right, is in fact delineated on economic issues. We should also keep in mind that Iran is going to have a presidential elections just like here, and the reformists, who are leftists in general, are going to try to keep away from unpopular stands, particularly since their main power, or perhaps their only real power, comes from the people's support for them. I'm sure Dr. Hadian will elaborate more on the political aspects. So I'll move on to the economic issues. The fact that there's a lot of difference in economic policies of the various factions in the reform camp tends to imply that for some time to come, major decisions on economic policy will remain on higher bodies such as the Expediency Council. Moreover, Iran's economic development path for the next few years has already been set in the Khatami administration's third five-year plan. A broad summary of what the third plan intends to do in order to alleviate the economic woes of Iran is telling of the thinking of the reformists close to Khatami. They want to give the economy a jump start by removing much of the bureaucratic obstacles that choke the growth of business and investment in Iran. We can expect a lot of institutional structural reforms during the third plan. With that preamble, the sixth Majlis will by no stretch of the imagination be off the hook in terms of economic policy making. We can expect to see the following laws and initiatives from the next Majlis in this regard, though they will take extensive debates and it will be a painstaking process. And we really don't expect them to be carried out before the presidential elections. What kind of laws am I talking about? Reformation of the tax laws, that's already in Parliament. Elimination of the special status for state companies, that is, imposition of tax, accountability regulations in state companies. This is actually one of the important plans Khatami had when the Guardian Council told him that privatization, and the Guardian Council rightfully told him that some of the privatization is against the Iranian constitution. So what Khatami did, he said, right, we're talking about the rule of the law. He had his own lawyers take a look at the books and realize that state companies are not allowed to have any special treatment over regular companies. So if you apply those laws, you don't have to privatize them. They'll sink if you take their subsidies away. There is a plan to reduce subsidies, introduction of transparent laws of privatization, drafting and passing new capital markets, etc. But the question is, how is the reform camp, which is largely dominated by leftists who believe in social justice, going to tackle tough economic issues? The answer, unsurprisingly, is through the use of astute maneuvering and creative politics. The main issue for a lot of the leftist group in the reform camp is adhering to their slogans and not losing face. New drafts dealing with economic issues will have to come as a package which includes elements that can be accepted by all of the sub-factions that make up the reform movement. Let's use a hypothetical example of seeing how this could work. You need to remove subsidies and you're a social justice group. Well, we're very good at the game of labels in Iran. You simply label it the poverty eradication bill instead of the subsidy removal bill. You start out, this happens. They start out with a good preamble on how class difference between the rich and the poor has grown wider in Iran, and that issue needs to be addressed. In order to address it, they say, let's take away the subsidies we give to the rich and give more to the poor. This is a compromise. Give more, not take away. So essentially, what they do to take away part of the subsidies is they play a game of language. In short, expect that tougher economic items on the agenda would get dealt with in a sugar-coated fashion, but they will be dealt with. In the meantime, the country would continue to use and expand the backdoor option by strengthening the role of free trade zones, special economic zones, and the like. Furthermore, despite the fact that many differences exist among the reformist ranks when it comes to economic issues, we can't ignore the positive energy factor that has come about as a result of the latest elections among both Iranians and foreign investors involved in the Iranian economy. The reaffirmation of the people's vote to the reformists has increased confidence in Iran in general, a process that strengthened the economy. This process is seen best in the fact that the rial gained against the dollar immediately after the election results were announced. In conclusion, today the results of the 18th February elections are in, reaffirming the reform movement with another landslide victory. In the word of Iran's reformists themselves, 29th of Bahman was another 2nd of Khordad, referring to the Persian calendar date of the latest parliamentary and presidential elections, respectively. But the votes cast on 18th of February did more than that. They showed just how unpopular the ways of the conservatives have become, and more importantly, that in today's political realities of Iran, those who pay no attention to public will can expect to find themselves marginalized from power. In American slang, they're saying it'll be our way or the highway. The latest Majlis elections has created a new momentum for two interrelated phenomena in Iran, i.e., the people's belief that they can determine their own political destiny and the president's reform agenda. The continuation of these two phenomena will have positive effects on Iran's democratization process. Notwithstanding, real change, especially in the field relating to economic structures, as well as to business realities in Iran, will take time to occur. Clearly, sustainable change and progress has to rely on decisions that can be carried by all key political forces of the country. Knowing that the initial agenda of the reformist movement in Iran was to reduce the domination of conservative forces in Iranian politics, it is clear that the objective has now been achieved. Therefore, the new question is how sustainable the alliance of the reformist forces is, especially when it comes to necessary economic reforms. Thank you.
I wish also to thank AIC and Asian Society and also Georgetown University for giving me such an opportunity to share some of my ideas with you. In fact, since I've already talked several times about election in Iran, I'll try to talk a little bit less about the election and also pay somehow some attention to a couple of statements which I perceive to be important by Ambassador Nejat Hosseinian. But first, about the election. Who were the reformers, in fact? There have been a lot of talk, and also as Siamak and Hadi talked. To me, the reformers basically are made up of two major groups. Although there are 18 groups in names, but I just want to simplify the reality and put them in two major groups. One, what we consider center or moderate, and the other one, or executive of constructions, or the other one also is the left or the reformist or the supporter of Khatami. Since last three elections, basically, these groups have made a sort of coalition, and that coalition have been very crucial for the winning of different elections. The background of these reformers, in fact, are old lefties of our society. Since the revolution, there have been a group which we call them left, but they have gone through a transformation. They are not. They don't have the same sort of a view which they had. Of course, there are people among them who still hold the same type of views which they had even before. So right after the revolution. But the core supporter do not think the same way, and their views are very much different. And they are the one, in fact, who have been the engine of change in Iran, in today's Iran. But who supported them? I believe the group which I call marginalized forces have been responsible or have been the main supporter of this group. These marginalized forces are women, youth, and modern middle class. They have been due to revolutionary policies and practices and processes. They have been alienated, and they have been marginalized for about a decade. And once they find a chance to express their protest and discontent from the process and policies, they expressed it. Last Majlis election, I'm talking 4 years, I'm talking about the fifth Majlis, also was a vote of protest. Daughter of former President Rafsanjani, Faiza, was officially number one, and many believe, in fact, officially number two, but many believe, in fact, she was number one. Vote to her in compared with Nataq Nouri, which then was identified as a symbol of status quo. Vote to Faiza Hashemi was, in fact, a vote for change, and that was a vote against the status quo. 4 years ago, they identified Nataq Nouri as status quo and a supporter and constructor or builder of status quo. That's why they voted against him. That was the case also for the last presidential election. In fact, Nataq Nouri was again identified as status quo, and also people voted to Khatami as a force for change. That was the case again in this election. But this time, Hashemi Rafsanjani was identified as a status quo. And if we analyze the Tehran's vote particularly, we see that Karoubi, who used to be the former Speaker of the Parliament, although he was included in the list of the reformists, but still his fate was not very good. He was number 26 or 27 in Tehran, which shows that he did very poorly. And also Muhtashami, although he was also included in the list of the reformists, he did not have enough vote to get into Majlis. It shows that, those who have been associated with the status quo, the people didn't want them, and they vote, in fact, against them. Although, even though they have been as a part of the reform movement, or they have been included in the list of reformists. Also, if we analyze the vote in Tehran, particularly number one, who was brother of President Khatami, not very much experienced politician, not very well-known figure in Iranian politics, but he had the number one vote with a wide margin comparing with the next one, the second one. Why that was the case? I believe that was a vote, in fact, to President Khatami. That was a vote of confidence. Number two, or the second person in Tehran, was Jamil Kadiva, whose brother is in the jail. Number three was Ali Reza Nouri, again, whose brother is in the jail. And Ali Reza Nouri, in fact, is a very, very new person in politics. He came to political scene, in fact, just a month before the election. Thus, there is no doubt about it that no one knew him, and the vote to him, in fact, was to vote to his brother. These are all very sophisticated voting behavior. The people exactly knew that whom they want to vote for and whom they don't want. And that was the case for number four, in fact. The number four is a brother of Supreme Leader. And he was voted exactly with the opposite reason. So it shows that, we may disagree with what they did, but they knew exactly whom they want to vote for, considering everyone in the list. These marginalized voices, as it is shown in their sophisticated voting behavior, are relatively educated people. And they were looking for a relatively cost-free situation to express their discontent. And voting or casting the ballot was relatively cost-free, and once they found the chance, they did so. So it shows that they have acted in a very sophisticated way. I wish to also address one more question and then go back to Nejat Hosseinian's talk. And that's about the reaction of the possible or the potential reaction of the conservatives in Iran. I believe there are three groups of them, I can divide them into three groups, two minor ones and one major one. The first group are those what I call rationalist or pragmatic conservative. They are calling for a sort of reorganizing themselves and also put a platform in front of the people for economic well-being of the society, for a better standard of living, for bringing down the inflation, and also bringing down the unemployment rate. They think they have to wait for another 4 years, and if they do work on these things, they have a good chance of regaining the control of Majlis in the next election. But they are a minority view in the conservative. The second group, which would form the majority of the conservative group, are the one who are very much related to clerical establishment in Iranian society. They are almost in all big cities. They are Friday prayer leaders, and also a number of parties in Iran who are very powerful, in Tehran, who are very powerful, are associated with them. For them, this is cultural issues, cultural invasions, erosion of Islamic values, which plays the prominent role. and they think that this process of reform should be stopped. And they would press undoubtedly the supreme leader for stopping the process. But as also today, as Ambassador Najat Hussainian also mentioned, I think that process is irreversible. It may be slowed down, but it cannot be stopped. And third group would be, in fact, they are not conservative, they are radical, but they are somehow in association with this conservative. They are the one who would call for, a sort of violence. They would call for a total stop in the reform process. They would consider these reformists as the agents of the foreigners or as being under their influence. And they think that they have to be removed from power positions, and they would press for that. I will not be surprised to see that they would do act of assassination and also attack the peaceful demonstrations, and they would do they may adopt other measures, in fact, to make the political scene less secure and more violent. And their plan is to make the political scene in a way that the security issues become the prominent issues of the society. But fortunately, they are not very powerful. They are not very powerful, and their numbers also is not very high. Okay, but let me go to Najat Hussainian talk and a couple of points which I believe was important to be considered. First of all, I believe, as I was told, he did not know exactly what was, particularly in regard to coup d'etat, and also about the war and the role of U.S. in the war. He did not know exactly what's going to be said about those things. And also, although he mentioned some points about them, but he was not informed, thus probably the appropriate response would come from Tehran. Second is his talk in regard to Nowruz, Iranian New Year. Also, there was some crucial points there which demands a careful consideration in regard to the peace, and also in regard to reconciliation, and also a new day to cleanse the soul, and also as this, considering these things, paying attention to these things are very important. The next key phrase, I believe, was measured, proportionate response, which I hope that would come from Tehran, and he mentioned that would for sure would come. But the most crucial point, I believe, was, of course, I need to mention one point before I discuss this point, and that's, in fact, the view or the debate in Iran that there are people who would believe that this new Majlis can do everything. I mean, as soon as they are in the Congress and the new Majlis convene, they are capable and able to adopt the policies and adopt policies fundamentally and radically different from the past. As Hadi also elaborated on, that's not going to be the case. That minority, conservative minority, is very powerful outside the Majlis, and expecting them that they would do a lot and very radically different from the past probably is not a very appropriate expectation, not realistic expectation. And also, there are people who think that, they cannot do anything. They cannot change anything. That also is not, I believe, a realistic perspective. In the question and answer, I would further elaborate, since my time is getting close to over. I would explain further that how and what they can do in the Majlis in terms of the foreign policy. But the crucial point for me, the most crucial point, was He was talking about dialogue in a normalized in a normalized relation, in a situation devoid of pressure, sanction, allegations, and grandstanding. If my understanding is right, I believe probably he's proposing, in fact, in a fast track. I mean, he was also, as Secretary Albright mentioned, two-track. In fact, a fast track and a slow track. I mean, that was somehow implicit there. I mean, he mentioned the slow track or the gradual incremental change, but also a fast track could have been derived from his talk as well. And that would include, or that we can characterize that in this way, that probably in a within a normalized relations, meaning forget about the talk, about the dialogues, preconditions or conditions of dialogue. We have been talking about those issues for about 3 years. Probably we can change that perspective rather than putting our attempt for negotiation or dialogue. Let's go for sort of relationship. And that can be done probably, and the talk or dialogue or the concern of both countries can be addressed, in fact, after establishment of relationship. In other words, in a normalized relation, the phrase which he used. Normalized relation, and also I believe he referred to Europe. All those issues, he said, are being addressed and are being addressed and talked with EU. In other words, that can be also addressed with US as well. But the point is the framework or the atmosphere of talk. Probably in a normalized relation, those issues can be addressed in a better way and more effective way. That's what I understood. I may be wrong, but I tend to be, that track is open. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks all panelists for being punctual and also quite informative. We will have 15 minutes for question and answer, and please introduce yourself, raise your hand, and welcome to have the questions. Yes, please. And to whom you are addressing the question also.
Okay.
Whose whistle is this? Is it mine or not? It's mine?
Thank you. This question, my name is Babak Talabi. I'm from Iranians for International Cooperation, which is a non-government organization here in the United States. My question is mostly addressed to Siamak and Dr. Samati, although Dr. Khadian, if you can comment on it, I would appreciate that as well. And that involves Iranian organization, Iranian non-government organizations within Iran. Siamak mentioned the advent of political parties being a little bit more realistic with this new majlis, and what I was wondering was how realistic would it be to assume that Iran will open its doors to assemblage by Iranians in the hope of furthering their concerns? I guess what we would call lobby groups here in the U.S. or non-government organizations here in the U.S., such as AIC. What is the reality of that occurring in Iran? I know we already have educational groups and such, but more kind of along the lines of politics and social issues. Thank you.
This doesn't work. I can speak loud enough, perhaps.
No, it won't get on the tape, though.
You want to come in? Yeah, you can. Yeah, thanks.
It works? No? Thanks. I understand Babak's question a little more clearly. I think he wants to know when he can have his IIC branch Tehran. If I understood the question correctly. Yeah. little adverts in the press. You're catching this, I see. I think you can already, and then the measures are there, but it's a difficult process. Registering a business, a regular for-profit business, is a very complicated process. Non-profits, at times registering them, the people have bypassed through various like foundations or, but yes, this Majlis, you can expect them to make the legal kind of loopholes you'd have to go through a lot easier. In terms of freedom of assembly and what you can do and what you can't, I think you'd be amazed at what's there in Iran, and I think you guys are lagging behind the realities. It's already there. All you're dealing with now is bureaucratic loopholes, and you can't expect them to get easier.
Please.
My name is Jape Yousefi. My question is in regard to the area of high tech. This is the area that we represent. Although we welcome administration's gesture today for removing the sanctions, those particular industries traditionally benefit the Bazari people that are very well established in those industries. We believe that the IT industry, which Iranians are very active in the United States, according to the latest IEEE surveys, Iranians are the highest paid IT professionals in the United States. And we have tremendous resources, and we can bring a lot of jobs into Iran by hiring a lot of young people who are the engine behind President Khatami's success. Don't you think it would be appropriate for the administration to also take a look at the IT restrictions so we can bring more jobs and more opportunity? Already Canadians and Europeans are very active in this area, and they have taken the lead. Actually, you would be, since you've been an ambassador, so you...
Is it too embarrassing if I say that I didn't follow the question? So may I ask, Siamak is better.
Well, you're asking about if the American administration should let go of that?
I'm not picking you up, I'm sorry.
You're asking if the American administration should let go? Sure.
That's the problem with long questions. That's the problem with long questions. Please make it short. Yes.
Just a brief comment. Actually, that's an interesting area where, some of the arguments about software industry in Iran, which is one of the more fertile and more resourceful areas of expertise. Some of the top students in Sharif University are developing softwares that are actually incredible. And this is an area where you could argue, and of course in hardware, you could argue there are going to be plenty of opportunity for export. I mean, Iran is definitely, in terms of resources, human resources, is very, very, very rich in that area. And I suspect if, of course, management in Iran and competence in terms of managing and coordinating these activities kind of coordinated with this lifting of sanctions in this part of the world will absolutely help to flourish this area. This is one of the areas that I think Iran could, at least in the next 5-10 years, could develop into something like $5 billion export industry. These are the estimates that the plan and budget is actually.
Let me answer you a little more seriously. One of the great problems you'll find in Iran, in terms of U.S. really removing that, is the fact that our copyright laws are non-existent. There is a bypass, and that is that companies can have contracts. And that means just because there isn't a blanket law, you and I can't get in a contract among ourselves that would do that. Another problem in Iran, and I think there's an article on that on the table out, is that every IT guy who gets to a certain level immigrates to Canada. And this is a very, very serious issue. I've actually tried to hire one, and I went through the loops and I interviewed these guys and found out that because they can't rise over a certain limit, that they will immigrate out. So it is a very important level to issue of concern for Iran. On this side, I talked to some commerce people, and I was told that it is on the agenda of the next thing to go through because of the large pressure of the lobbies here, not because of anything in Iran.
Yes, please.
Hello, my name is Sassam Kahramani. I work for a financial advisory institution, And my question is more on the financial side, so maybe Mr. Namazi may address it, but it addresses some of the political issues as well. I hear this reference to the leftist forces and the conservative forces frequently, and I understand this is more a fundamentalist versus social, shall we say, liberal force, but there is the economic leftist issue as well. It seems to me that there is a danger in this whole reform process that and I'm saying this from a view of unavowed capitalism, I have to caveat, but that the agenda of economic reform gets taken over by the conservative forces. Is there something on the side of, as you would call, the reform group, which is more investment friendly and capital friendly?
Take a look at Khatami's third five-year plan, and you'll see a lot in there. Basically, the debate between the conservatives and the leftists, and again, this is on economic, a split on the economic level, came out right before the elections when Khatami and Rafsanjani got into a de facto debate. And Rafsanjani's camp, which represents the spirit of the reformists, were trying to go with a slogan, "It's the economy, stupid," and go on with it, run with it. Khatami said something that, as an Iranian businessman, makes a lot of sense to me. He said, look, the issue is political development, then economic, or the reverse. The right is saying economic development first, and then we can get around to the political issues. Khatami responded to that very well. He said, look, if you want to have a working economy, you have to have a bureaucratic structure that works. That's why during my tour in Washington, a lot of people have been asking me what happens if we remove sanctions completely on Iran, what would the Iranian economy look like, or what effect has it had? I said the Iranian economy would still look pretty horrible. Why? Because when I came to register my business, I had to go through 56 names just so they'd approve one. This is a very simple example, but and this is exactly what Khatami said. He said you have to be able to encourage entrepreneurship for this motor to work. And look at what they're saying, what they're trying to reform. The reformist camp's kind of economic agenda is saying, let's simplify the bureaucracy. Let's get rid of all these parallel structures. Let's make it transparent. Let's get rid of the unfair competition coming from the bunyads. The Ministry of Intelligence was allowed to have economic activity. Actually, they were very strong in the software and computer sector. They're out. And that really, really does help, and it's encouraging.
Yes, please.
My name is Iqtidari. I represent Iran National Front. I take an issue with Siamak that you said, you gave the impression, look like everything is free and good. I really challenge the reformists in Iran, that are they really sincere when the main slogan in Iran for election was, Iran is for everybody. That means both on religious grounds for all the other minorities and also for other people who think differently. Just like National Front. Iran National Front is not free. It cannot have an office in Iran. It cannot have a publication in Iran. My question is, why this is so? Are the reformist movement really sincere in its distinguishing that concept of khodi and not khodi, that is one of the main slogan of the rightist one? Or we have heard that even within the reformist movement, this concept is accepted as khodi and ghair khodi. We hope that this is something of the past and liberalization process will take hold. And of course, we know that's going to be, on a slow pace. But for the beginning, we expect that the sixth Majlis at least address this issue that all political parties, regardless of their affiliation, as long as they respect the constitution and are within the framework of Iran, they can actually participate and have the right and be protected against the vigilante groups that they come and they destroy their offices and they destroy or attack their gathering. I appreciate your response.
Pardon? Okay. Before Hadi would comment on that, I think one of the very important development which took place in Iran on the economic side which somehow refers to what you're saying from the economic side, is that the intelligence ministry decided that they should dismantle all their economic activities. And that was a major measure in order to safeguard the security of economic operations of business sector in Iran. But how did you want to?
Can I just, so it's, I don't want to give any image that, you know, I don't want to defend anything or say anything about what you're saying. Clearly, the Ghair Khodis, especially the national religious figures, were the main target of the vetting process, which was not a very smart tactical move for people who were trying to break votes. But I could suggest that as a secular person in Iran, I'm in a worse situation. You're at least a former Khodi group. So I don't want to stand up here and say that I'm defending what's happening, but I am in Iran and I'm seeing a lot of changes that I admire. But I could say that personally, I'm a businessman in Iran, a political analyst, and an admirer and an optimist about the reform movement. But I'll let Dr. Sanlai to comment further.
Yeah, just a brief comment. Actually, when the reform movement, the pro-Khatami factions or coalition decided on the slogan "Iran for all Iranians," of course, there were debates about the full implications of that slogan, what it means and what it would mean, and people understood the difficulties and problems of that, given the past experience and what the forces that it would unleash. But nonetheless, I think they decided that consciously and intentionally they decided on that because they really meant that. Of course, there are people within the reform movement who would not necessarily be on intentions all that goodwill, but the insider, outsider of this debate in Iran, Khodi wa Ghair Khodi, was responded by the reform movement in the context of the constitution. The only demarcation for insider and outsider the constitution. This is the first step. I think they expounded on that idea very, very clearly and basically outright, that this is the basic criteria with which we will judge who is insider, who is outsider. And the way they came out to defend the exclusion and disqualification of certain national religious groups, particularly from freedom movement and the rest, it indicated that they are conscious of the fact that I think the point is that yes, a lot of injustices have been done against a lot of people who were unjustifiably disqualified. And of course, the whole concept of insider and outsider is changing itself also in this dynamic. I think this is going to be one of the issues that this new parliament will deal with in terms of the party politics and party legislation. What sort of parties will be allowed? And I'm as Siam said, I'm myself optimistic, but there are all range of issues that are very much contingent, definitely.
Yes, please. I think.
I have a question about the current discourse on foreign policy in Iran, and the fact that I believe it's the way it's displayed in the press, the Dovom Khordad newspapers, it's not proactive enough, I believe. And I'd like to know if you agree with that, and whether you predict the emergence of a new discourse on Iranian foreign policy that's somewhat different from the remarks we heard from the ambassador today, and more focused on the idea of what Iran's national interests are and how those national interests may be strengthened by normalized relations with the U.S. Thank you.
You are right, Alidad, that the foreign policy issues have not been significant issues in Iran. Among all, I can say almost all of these groups who are participating in Iranian political process, and I don't think so. That's going to be in the next Majlis. Foreign policy somehow, or like economic policy, would be a secondary issue. And there are reasons for that. Although me and Hadi have tried very hard to convince many of them that they have to pay attention also to foreign policy, but because of the immediate problem which would come from these factional politics in Iran, they are mostly concerned with the domestic politics. First of all, as both Siamak and Hadi mentioned, probably the first issues in the Majlis or the first laws which are going to be passed in this Majlis are going to be the laws, in fact, regarding to Iran for all Iranians, welcoming back every Iranian to come to Iran, and a sort of general amnesty for everyone who have somehow committed crime. And also the other issues would be press law, election law, a unified court system, or judiciary reform. These are going to be the first issues which they are going to deal with. In other words, securing their gains and expanding on that. But that's not for the government. Executive branch undoubtedly would pay more attention both to economic policies and foreign policy. But the Majlis would provide a very good forum and opportunity to strengthening the hand of reformists, or in fact supporting any sort of initiative which may come from the government. That was not the case before. Our government was very much concerned if they want to take initiative that they are not going to have the support of the Congress or the Majlis. But that's not the case now. And I believe this Majlis is going to be very much supportive of any sort of initiatives in regard to foreign policy in general and U.S. Iran relation in particular. They are going to be very much supportive.
Very brief comment.
I will take one last question after.
Actually, I think a change of discourse is quite visible in Iranian politics in all areas. And I think even though it started from reform movement and political movement, political reform in Iran, it is percolating itself into all major areas. So I would urge you, probably all of you have seen or read the defense of Abdullah Nouri, which actually was, in my judgment, a principal document in terms of couching foreign policy issues in national interest terms. This is the sort of language that are new pretty much to Iranian politics. National interest and the sort of language and discourse that are pretty much the normal, ordinary international relations discourse have not been pretty much dominant in Iranian politics. But I think the discourse in terms of non-violence, transparency, and everything else, all of that, those terminologies are having its own impact on foreign policy discussions as well. So my basic brief answer is that, yes, a discourse is developing, and all these papers that are talking about peace process or talking about the merits of signing up to NPT, CTBT, the Chemical Weapons Conventions, and the opposing view that are now played out in the press, that these conventions that have been signed by Iran are actually detrimental to the Iranian security. So this is playing out, it's becoming more of a natural public debate, right or wrong. And
one last question, please. Yes, gentlemen.
Yes, I'm Bill Jones from Executive Intelligence Review News Service. The ambassador, in his initial comments, you mentioned more generally over the question of sanctions and the usefulness of sanctions. Not solely related to Iran, and I thought I'd just ask the question, since you have a kind of a unique view on this, that this debate about sanctions has also been a very heated one in the United States. We have the case of the sanctions against Iraq, which have done much to cause suffering among many people in Iraq, but have done little to resolve the question of Saddam Hussein. And I was wondering, since this is also a problem for you, and since you're critical of the sanctions regime, if you have any ideas with regard to how the U.S. or how other countries should react in trying to change the situation in the country, rather than resorting to a measure which has been called a substitute for war.
Thank you. I think that's a very important point. My general view is that sanction nowhere has worked. Look at the Iraqi case, in fact, and in a few minutes, Rosemary Forsyth is going to close this meeting, and she probably will refer to the question of oil. We have had expansive sanctions on Iraq, and sanctions on Iran are by far less. However, what we see as the result is that There is much, actually 1/3 of Iraqi oil is coming to America despite the sanctions. And as you rightly said, people are suffering by far more than the government. The alternative, I think, is, as I mentioned, engagement. As the Iranian experience, for example, with United Nations throughout the year, warriors showed that engagement really is the alternative. Engagement not only with the people. Now, one of the very interesting cases between Iran and United States is that it's not limited, the extent of relation is not limited between the two governments. Look at the course of peoples-to-peoples relations. This century is going to be the century for non-governmental relations, NGO to NGO relations. And therefore, I think if we look at it from that perspective, engaging NGOs from different countries, people-to-people contact, and even engaging the governments, I think it would probably solve our problems by far in a better way. Now, I cannot go more into specifics in our limited time. I have to close this panel by thanking our panelists. John Watson asked me to end up this panel with a poetry. And since I'm coming from Shiraz, I could not resist that temptation. And the most brilliant, beautiful poetry that in the recent days I saw was in an ad of New York Times. And that was really brilliant, which said in Persian and then in English, آن سوی مرز درست و نادرست صحنه دیدار بین ما و توست. It beautifully said that outside there, beyond the borders of right and wrong, beyond the borders of who is right and who is wrong, there is a field where we should meet. And I think it was really a beautiful quotation from Rumi, who is bringing the Persian spirit of mysticism to America in an amazing manner. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks our panelists. Thank you very much our panelists. The closing remarks will be done by Rosemary Forsyth. We talked a lot about removing sanctions from Persian carpet, but I think lots of Iranian and American analysts do agree with me that there is also a very important carpet underneath, and that's oil carpet underneath that Rosemary is going to hopefully tackle, that we hope that the sanctions would also be lifted on that underneath the ground carpet. Rosemary Forsyth is the ExxonMobil corporate senior government relations and issues advisors and coordinate the corporate government relations worldwide. Rosemary has been previously with Mobil Corporation, and before that she has been a U.S. diplomat for a whole decade, more than a decade. It's really amazing when I look into her resume, the number of countries that you have traveled and the number of expertise that you have achieved. The floor is yours. Thanks a lot.
I and my company ExxonMobil would like to thank the organizers for the opportunity both to lend a business perspective to these proceedings and also to wrap up this fascinating day. I think a resounding theme we've heard throughout the day has been one of change. Change in Iran, change in the region, and change in U.S.-Iranian relations. One of the reasons behind these changes is the rise of a new generation. As all of you undoubtedly know, 2/3 of the Iranian population are below 25 years of age. And most of these people aren't old enough to remember the revolution or remember the most bitter moments of the U.S.-Iranian relations. So with this new generation, I think come new opportunities to move away from the legacy of the past into a new relationship and dialogue that would benefit both countries. Secretary Albright spoke of planting the seeds for a new beginning, and I think this new generation provides fertile ground for those seeds. We welcome the changes that Secretary Albright announced today. These, combined with earlier gestures on food, medicine, and cultural exchanges, academic exchanges, move the U.S.-Iranian relationship forward. And we understand, of course, that significant issues remain. And we discussed those issues during this conference, those having to do with weapons of mass destruction and terrorism. These are serious issues, and they require serious discussion. And like many of the participants in this conference, we encourage direct dialogue. At the same time, we believe the U.S. could do more to reach out to the Iranians interested in change, particularly those young Iranians I mentioned. They hold the key to the future of the Middle East's most populous nation. We believe that many of the U.S. gestures directed towards these people would help build popular support for direct dialogue and cooperation. So we believe that this expansive yet prudent policy could serve U.S. interests, take advantage of new opportunities, and address increasingly ineffective policies such as unilateral sanctions. I'd like to mention 5 proposals that my company, ExxonMobil, support. First, and this will probably not surprise you, that we believe that unilateral sanctions prohibiting U.S. energy investments in Iran should be removed. For nearly 20 years now, the U.S. has tried to influence Iran by containing it with tough economic sanctions. This policy worked as long as the international community supported the sanctions and as long as Iran remained closed to the outside world. This is no longer the case. In the present environment, these unilateral sanctions, 1, are ineffective, 2, they harm innocent citizens, 3, they cost American companies sales and jobs, and 4, they exacerbate relations with our European allies. The Iran-Libya Sanctions Act and the executive orders swing at Iran, but they hit only U.S. companies. What American companies need to do, they need to have the ability to do the same as our competitors. Ambassador Pelletreau mentioned several of the companies who concluded deals with Iran: Shell, Eni, ELF, BP Amoco, Total, Gazprom, Petronas, Sinopec, and many other companies are winning attractive deals, business deals in Iran, while our own country's sanctions have forced us to stand on the sidelines. Let me give you some figures on this. Since 1997, European and Asian competitors have completed at least 11 deals that violate the $20 million Iran-Libya Sanctions Act limit. These and other non-U.S. companies are in the midst of negotiating at least 18 other similar agreements. And there may be more. I'm just citing a number of those that we've counted in the open press. Foreign companies are ignoring the Iran-Libya Sanctions Act. We don't believe the answer is to enforce ILSA. We believe that the answer is to remove ILSA and to remove the executive orders that prevent our working there. Now, if we can't eliminate the unilateral sanctions immediately, or if the process must proceed in stages, then we believe that we should at least be allowed to negotiate direct investments in Iran pending the lifting of sanctions. The U.S. did the same in Vietnam, and this helped U.S. business interests, while at the same time keeping the policy in sync with U.S. foreign policy interests. Now, I'd like to maybe go into a little more detail on the Vietnam example, because I think it's very instructive for us. The permitted activity for U.S. companies in Vietnam pending the lifting of sanctions included: 1, the negotiating and signing executory contracts pending the lifting of sanctions; 2, hiring staff; 3, writing and designing plans; 4, carrying out preliminary feasibility studies, engineering and technical surveys; and 5, related import, export, and service transactions. We believe U.S. companies should be allowed to do these things in Iran. In addition, until sanctions are lifted, U.S. businesses should be allowed to spend up to the $20 million limit that our competitors are allowed to spend in Iran, our non-U.S. competitors. This package of measures would achieve 3 goals in our mind. First, it would avoid having U.S. companies fall behind their non-U.S. competition. Second, it would ensure that American industry has a place in line when sanctions are lifted. And three, by allowing preparation and studies, it would show Iran the potential benefits of U.S. participation in their economy and provide incentives for those, for overall cooperation and for building those bridges to bring down, this wall. A second proposal, that I wanted to mention of the five is to allow environmental cooperation in the Caspian and the Gulf. U.S. companies are prohibited from going to Iran to engage in dialogue with the government on these issues. Numerous proposals exist now. There are numerous bilateral and multilateral proposals, and these should be, seriously considered. They include cooperation on things like emergency response procedures in the Caspian, the sharing of best practices, or other actions that we could all take to safeguard the environment. The UN Caspian Environmental Program, for example, has several proposals for cooperation with Iran on many of these important issues, and U.S. businesses would like to participate in those programs in Iran. A third proposal is to allow U.S. companies to use Iranian equipment in the Caspian, Iranian equipment such as rigs. I don't know if many of you are aware of this, but rigs are in very short supply in the Caspian. And the use of Iranian rigs could accelerate development of the entire region. Use of Iranian equipment could help reduce costs in the Caspian area and make Central Asian and Caucasus energy supplies much more competitive. A fourth proposal is to allow limited oil swaps or exchanges. As many of you may know, in 1998, Mobil, my former company, applied to swap a limited amount of oil to benefit the production of oil in Turkmenistan. I was swap a limited amount of oil with Iran. The U.S. chose to deny that swap. And this denial, we think, sent confusing signals to Turkmenistan, which stood to benefit the most from the swap. Finally, our fifth proposal is that the U.S. might permit U.S. companies to buy Iranian oil. Today, all the oil Iran wants to sell is purchased by non-U.S. companies. The U.S. gains nothing by restricting these purchases. On the other hand, U.S. companies could buy crude. If they could buy crude, it would, one, help optimize supply systems, and two, keep U.S. companies competitive versus their competition. As we all know, and one of our speakers mentioned today, the U.S. allows U.S. oil companies to buy oil from Iraq. And Iraq is a huge, as I think Ambassador Mahalati had said, Iraq is a huge supplier of U.S. oil. So, I just want you to know it is a country vital to the region and vital to the energy industry. And yes, there are valid policy concerns that need to be addressed in a prudent and decisive manner. But let American business in, because experience has shown that relationships get better and cooperation improves when this happens. I mean, I think Ambassador Pelletreau mentioned that there are countless examples in history of this, and we would like the opportunity to participate in these actions. So, several of today's speakers mentioned other policy options, changes that could be elements of a more expansive policy. And I'm just going to mention a few because I think, I think some of these really deserve to be seriously considered. There are World Bank projects involving waste treatment, education, more cooperation on refugee issues. Iran is home to one of the largest populations of refugees in the world. And supporting these programs would help deal with a serious problem and send the right signal to Iranian people. Drug control problems. I think Secretary Albright said that the U.S. may be willing to cooperate more in these drug control problems, and I think that would be an excellent step in the right direction. And then finally, more cultural exchanges. I know there have been several cultural exchanges, but we'd like to see more. And on that note, I'd like to make a special announcement. As a longtime supporter of the arts, ExxonMobil plans to fund 2 cultural projects with Meridian International. These two major projects would constitute the first major arts exchange between Iran and the U.S. in the last 2 decades. The first project is an exhibition of U.S. art, which will go to the Tehran Museum of Contemporary Art in October, November 2000. And the second project is an exhibit of Iranian art, which will tour the U.S. in the year 2001. Nancy Matthews, and I think she's in the audience somewhere. Yes, there she is. She's worked very hard to develop this project and bring it to fruition, and we're very excited about it. We think it's going to be a great project, and I think it will really further many of the objectives that I've mentioned in my speech today. Overall, like most of the participants in this conference, ExxonMobil is encouraged by the changes in Iran, and we continue to encourage the U.S. government to expand its policy in a prudent manner, to take a more sophisticated approach, and more of these steps to reach out to this new generation of Iranians who I think are the key to the future. Thank you. I would be remiss, actually, if I received a reminder from the conference organizers that they would like me to mention, and I do with great pleasure, that there is a Persian New Year party tonight at the hotel, and you can register outside the door to the right, I'm told. So, but I think I can take a few questions if you like. Or you're probably all anxious to go and celebrate the Persian New Year. Okay, that's fine. Thank you very much.